This is a recording of the Dr. Rachel Bronson Conference with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on September 26, 2016 at 9 a.m. Central Time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. Please be aware that each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. At the conclusion of today's remarks, we'll be opening the floor for your questions. At that time, instructions will be given as to the procedure to follow if you would like to ask a question. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, Dr. Rachel Bronson.
Good morning. On behalf of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, we're delighted to be hosting this global teleconference on nuclear instability in Northeast Asia. The recent nuclear tests have certainly focused global attention as well as ours, and we've been doing extensive coverage of it, as you may have seen from following our website and journal. Because of the urgency and importance of this issue, we thought it was time to host one of these telecons and reach out to our followers across the globe, and I'm delighted to say from the attendance list that we can say that we're really covering kind of all time zones across the world on this. We are unfortunate at this moment to say that Chungyun Moon, who we've been keen to include on this, has yet to join the call, so we're hoping that he's going to join us as we get going. But I'm delighted that Suzanne DiMaggio and Mark Fitzpatrick are with us, as well as Julian Borger, who's our moderator today. So I do want to turn it over to him shortly. As our operator said, we'll be able to take some questions at the end, and they'll be queued up. So if you do have thoughts, definitely don't hesitate to get into the queue. So with that, let me turn it over to Julian Borger, Julian, thanks for your coverage of the work that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been doing. We kind of welcome every time you reach out and use some of our data or our analysis. And so as you all saw from the invitation that we sent out, he's the diplomatic editor for The Guardian. He's covered a number of issues, having served as the Middle East correspondent and its Washington bureau chief. He's part of a team that has won the Pulitzer Prize and just seems to cover, if there's a major issue breaking, Julian's covering it from The Guardian. I'm also delighted then to introduce you to Mark Fitzpatrick and Suzanne DiMaggio. Mark is the Washington-based America's director of the U.S. office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. For those of you following his work, Mark has done extensive coverage of Northeast Asia, and so we're really pleased to have him on, as he's been following this closely and writing prolifically on it for some time. And then Suzanne DiMaggio is the director and senior fellow at New America, where she's probably best known for extensive Track 2 work on U.S.-Iran relations, and over the last several years has turned her gaze back to Asia and is recently back from North Korea and is thinking through about what kind of dialogue could be possible as we move forward. So that's a bit of background. If Chungyun joins us, those on the phone know that he's Professor Emeritus at Yonsei University in Seoul, and he's a recent contributor to one of the Bulletin's roundtables on the challenge on the Korean Peninsula. So with that, Julian, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I think probably a good place to start would be to try and get a perspective on what is happening here. It seems to me, covering it, that suddenly there is this acceleration of events. We had, in August, North Koreans tested this two-stage solid fuel rocket submarine missile. And then when the world leaders, G20, were meeting in China on 5th of September, you had this salvo of three missiles showing that they could let off more than one at the same time. And then, of course, on September 9th, the nuclear test. So I guess maybe if we start off with Mark Fitzpatrick, do you think that there is a change of pace? Is there an acceleration here in what North Korea is doing, and to what end?
Well, there certainly has been an acceleration in North Korea's development of strategic weapons systems. Both the pace and lethality of what is being tested this year outpace former years. Previously, there had been 3 or 4 years between tests of nuclear devices. This year, we had 2 tests in the space of 8 months. And the second test earlier this month was twice the magnitude of all previous tests. You know, there's been a tendency to downplay North Korea's bombastic announcements. It always exaggerates. But what they've been saying is consistent with what they're actually testing. When they said most recently that the recent test was of a warhead that could be mounted onto rockets, most analysts, myself included, have no doubt about that. And the rockets, the missiles, are being tested with also a greater intensity, 16 missile tests this year, including of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, including of a extended-range Scud missile, and of a Nodong that entered Japan's exclusive economic zone. So, and then most recently, North Korea tested an 80-ton thrust engine, which could, if used for intercontinental ballistic missiles, could see North Korea being able to target the United States within a few years. So, yes, there's definitely been a ratcheting up. Why that is, maybe Suzanne is in a better position to offer an analysis.
Suzanne, you were there in spring, and what is if you get a sense of what this regime or this leader intends to do with his growing arsenal?
Yes, well, first let me just say thank you to Rachel for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, I think the North Koreans are doing, as Mark said, exactly what they said they would be doing, and they've made it clear in announcements and elsewhere that they would be pursuing their nuclear program with gusto. So this is, you know, it should not come as a surprise to us. Maybe the pace of the progress is a bit surprising, but certainly the focus on it shouldn't come as a surprise to us. When I was there earlier this year, some of the discussions focused on how they now are a nuclear power, and that's how they want to be seen, a nuclear weapons power. And, you know, what you hear and is always, you know, it's never quite clear what is negotiations where clearly they need some economic relief. So I think at this stage of the game, here we are in a situation where they're moving forward, and we're at the end of an administration, by the way, that has done a remarkable job reaching out to countries where we've had adversarial relations for decades and changing that, you know, everyone from Iran to Myanmar and Cuba. But on North Korea, we've seen no progress whatsoever during the Obama administration. So I think this, you know, we're not in hurry up and panic mode yet, but we may be getting there. And I think certainly this is going to fall to the next president's top priorities on what and how to deal with it.
So, Suzanne, you're not clear whether this is still a bargaining counter to be given away for the right price, or whether it's gone beyond that and they see themselves as a nuclear power and that there's no going back.
You know, my own assessment is I have not made that determination yet. I've seen other analysts that have said, you know, this is North Korea now, and we have to get on with it and live with them as a nuclear weapons power. That very well may be the case, but my position is, first, I think we need dialogue with them to determine if that is indeed what they say is indeed what they want. And there has been so little dialogue over these years that, frankly, I don't know how anyone could say with certainty what the North Koreans want. even in my discussions with them, I feel like I received mixed signals on this. So on the one hand, they made it very clear that the denuclearization talks are off the table, but there may be other things to talk about. But on the other hand, they have presented ideas that possibly could lead to denuclearization. So I think we're at a stage now where we have to make a serious effort to engage them. There are some ways to go about that, and I think we can glean some lessons from the Iran negotiations. They're limited, but they're there. So maybe we could talk about that later.
Mark, one here? Yeah, absolutely. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, North Korea's pronouncements over the past few years and the wording in its constitution and every other signal that they've sent make it very clear that they want to be regarded as a nuclear-armed state. They have no intention, according to everything they say, of negotiating away nuclear weapons in exchange for any economic or diplomatic benefits. What they say is that only if the United States removes its nuclear threat would they consider lowering their nuclear guard. They regard nuclear weapons as essential for their own defense and deterrence. I think that nobody's intent on invading them, and they're more likely to fall from within, and nuclear weapons won't help with that. But I think, based on what they say, they're not going to trade away nuclear weapons. And the United States is far from removing its own nuclear weapons. The United States has no nuclear weapons stationed on the Korean Peninsula. They were all removed in 1991. There are no weapons on surface ships around the peninsula, but the United States does have strategic weapons that can obliterate North Korea in a matter of minutes, and those aren't going away either. So I think that North Korea is going to have nuclear weapons as long as there is a North Korean state. But whether they can be persuaded to accept some limits on the program, moratoria on testing, which they've done before, and other limits that might result in a deterioration of the program, that may all be within the realm of the possible if there could be negotiations. Whether there could be negotiations like there were in Iran, there are different factors, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about that.
Because the question is, how do you get from here to the point where you sit down, and how do you avoid it being the case in which the worse their behavior, the more tests they do, the more aggressive they are, the keener the other side, the U.S. is in sitting down, and therefore the problem of rewarding bad behavior. How do you get quiet dialogue and avoid that? That's Suzanne.
That's always. Oh, that's funny.
No.
Okay,
right.
So I have actually written about this recently. There are a few key lessons. First, let me make some very important qualifications. These are two very different cases. The most obvious difference is that nuclear weapons, North Koreans have nuclear weapons. The Iranians never had a nuclear weapon. So Iran is part of the NPT, North Korea is not. And, there's a list of differences going on and on and on. But where I see some useful ways of thinking is the diplomatic process whereby Iran and the U.S. got to the table. We can glean some lessons there. And I think this is something we should start thinking about. In the case of Iran, President Obama initiated that diplomatic channel, very low-key channel, secret in fact, and it was at the highest level. This is something he took on and made a commitment to. That sent a strong signal to the Iranians to take it seriously. In fact, many people have joked that President Obama himself is the equivalent of the Iran desk officer at the State Department. He's been so much involved in this. So I think we need to see similar leadership on the North Korea issue. I do think the low-key diplomatic channel that came about early was helpful, and maybe there is some way to bring that to the North Koreans where that could be replicated in one shape or way or form. On this issue, I also think it's important. I know a lot of talk, CFR issued a task force report recently that really seems to put a lot of our eggs in China's basket, that we really need to look to China to help solve this. Well, I just don't see that happening right now. In fact, what I hear from the North Koreans is that there is a centrality of the role of U.S. diplomacy that they would like to see come to the fore. That was certainly the case with Iran. The JCPOA, which came about at the end, was in some ways nominally a deal between Iran and the P5+1 states. That may be overstating it, but really it was the U.S. and Iran that got it off the ground, got the interim agreement off the ground. So the idea of the U.S. playing an important role. And then secondly, I think the fact that the Americans and Iranians, the negotiators, focused on a limited set of objectives. It wasn't a grand bargain, something they had tried over the years with the Iranians. And I think that also helped by focusing on the nuclear issue and a very limited set of issues. That helped clear the way for an agreement, an interim agreement. And then that provided the time and space for the regional actors, P5+1, to get together and come up with a comprehensive final accord. It was by no means easy. This all has unfolded now over the course of almost 4 years. It was a painstaking, incremental process, but it was clear that a strategic decision on both sides had been made to get this done. We haven't seen that yet from the U.S. Well, maybe we'll see it from the next president. We certainly haven't seen it from Pyongyang. So that is a big question mark. Is this what they want?
Mark, what's your take on to the extent the Iran route can work or is applicable to the North Korean case?
Well, first of all, I'd agree with almost everything that Suzanne said. The Iran deal had two key ingredients as I see it. One was it was a very effective combination of incentives and disincentives. And secondly, there was a willingness on both sides to make serious compromises. The United States, with regard to Iran, agreed to change its policy of no enrichment. Something similar might need to be in play for North Korea. But whether North Korea is willing to make any compromises, one doesn't see much willingness there. And, we don't know whether we have anybody in Pyongyang who would be a partner. But on the other hand, nobody really knows Kim Jong-un because nobody's met him. Now, with regard to the two-pronged strategy of incentives and disincentives, the focus has all been on the disincentives. We've tried some incentives over the years, and they could be tried again. But the disincentives really haven't been in play long enough to be effective. Up until this year, it was remarkable that the sanctions on Iran were tougher than the sanctions on North Korea, even though it was North Korea that was the nuclear-armed state and being more belligerent and threatening. So in this year, we have UN sanctions that then increased the pressure on North Korea to about the same level, and we had U.S. unilateral sanctions that have an extraterritorial component. That is, the United States is supposed to sanction Chinese or any other firms that are dealing with certain parts of the North Korean government, and those sanctions we haven't seen a lot of designations against Chinese entities, and the UN sanctions, as I say, have only been in place for a few months, and they have some loopholes that really need to be closed. I think when those loopholes are closed, when the United States starts designating Chinese entities that has an impact on China, then we might see more progress. So we probably need more time on the disincentives. And meanwhile, I would agree with Suzanne that the prospect for incentives can't be ruled out.
So you think there's still some mileage in sanctions? We haven't reached the end of the efficacy of sanctions on a regime that doesn't really care about the general well-being of its population. At least that's the perception, and not in the same way as the Iranian leadership really, it mattered to them the well-being of their of the population and how they voted?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Julian. I think in the North Korean case, there's no evidence of care about the general population. 2 million of whom starved in the 1990s. But there is they do need to take care of the inner circle of supporters, the nomenclatura, the 2,000 or so who rely on luxury goods and the kind of trade that is allowed from China. Plus, there's evidence that some Chinese entities are actually assisting with North Korea's nuclear and missile program by providing the ingredients for the engines, for example. There was a recent article the Asan Institute in Seoul did, and partnered with a Washington-based agency, did some remarkable work showing how some of this stuff is getting through. That needs to be stopped. So, yes, there are ways that the sanctions can be tightened. The loopholes that allow North Korea to continue to export coal and other minerals, if it's claimed it has a purpose to contribute to livelihood, that can be tightened. And so there's still a ways to go before judging that sanctions are not effective in the North Korean case.
Suzanne,
great.
Yeah.
On the issue of sanctions, I mean, let's not forget, throughout the negotiations for the nuclear deal with Iran, the U.S. was still sanctioning Iran. Not on nuclear, but on other issues and against individuals and so forth. And they may do it again on missiles and things like that. So the notion of sanctions, simultaneous sanctions and dialogue is not a non-starter. I mean, it could happen, and I think in the case of North Korea, that should be followed. It's very important, I think, the point that Mark made. I would call it the win-win narrative of the Iran negotiations. The negotiators on both sides, the U.S. and Iran, came to an early agreement that they would follow a win-win narrative that recognized that they would make concessions, that they knew they had to make hard concessions, and at the end, each team could be able to declare a victory. I think applying that sort of narrative is important. And I know it's very in vogue to say that it was the sanctions that brought the Iranians to the table. Well, that's part of the story, of course, a big part of the story. But the other point is during the secret negotiations, the U.S. Officials that engaged the Iranians were able to say authoritatively that the U.S. had moved away from regime change as a strategic objective, and also that the U.S. would allow Iran to have nuclear enrichment capability on their soil, of course, heavily monitored. So that also allowed the Iranians to accept the process of going forward with the negotiations. And I think, if we were going to go down this road with the North Koreans, we'd probably have to think of something creative like that to get some traction on it.
In the case of Iran, there was always the threat, very much highlighted by Benjamin Netanyahu, that Israel would take matters into its own hand and try a military solution. That threat doesn't really hang over North Korea in the same way, does it?
Maybe I could address that. It has not weighed into the equation to date. Back in 1994, during the first North Korean nuclear crisis, the Pentagon did prepare war plans. I mean, that's their job. They plan for a lot of different eventualities. And it was discussed at high levels in the U.S. government, and that option was discarded in favor of a diplomatic effort because of the realization that any military strike option would likely trigger a resumption of the Korean War and result in heavy damage to Seoul, the South Korean capital. But the issue has come back into play recently. The South Koreans are talking tougher. They're talking about preemptive attacks if necessary. If North Korea appears to be readying a missile that is not just a test, but actually targeting, South Korea is readying preemptive options, and they're talking about it out loud. I mean, they even floated last week a plan to take out the North Korean leadership. Now, I'm sure they have such plans. They certainly have these plans for a time, but to put that in public, that's ratcheting up the pressure another notch. And whether that's a good strategy or not, don't know.
And presumably, if, say, dialogue goes on and there are these contacts and talks, all the while the North Korean missile program is progressing and getting to the point where they can reach the continental United States, those questions must also put themselves again before a new president and before the Pentagon. So you come to the question of whether you allow things to get to the point where North Korea can reach America.
Yes, I think that's right. And if a nuclear tipped missile reaching continental U.S. is indeed a red line, we need to convey that to the North Koreans in no uncertain terms. That's another reason why I think dialogue would be important at this stage, to be very clear about what the U.S. is thinking in terms of North Korea's progress, what would trigger what action. I don't think those sorts of discussions have not happened. So, that's why I think at this stage, yes, we can and we should ratchet up the sanctions and the pressure, but clearly that's not going to solve the issue. The military option, I don't think will solve it either. It's very a dangerous path. I don't think anyone wants to go down. So we have to try dialogue at this point, and on that issue, I think with the Iran case, as we were ratcheting up the sanctions, we also found a way to tell the Iranians that there was a release valve. And I think the U.S. negotiators, to some extent, were able to find that sweet spot where the sanctions against Iran at that point, I think, were losing their efficacy. Some of our international partners were indicating it was unclear how long they were going to be willing to go along with them. And of course, the Iranians were finding creative ways to evade them, just as we see the North Koreans are doing now. So I do think that the notion of do we know what that sweet spot is yet with the North Koreans? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that is to engage them.
Sorry, Mark, was that you?
Yeah. This is Rachel from the Bulletin. I'm mindful of time. Julian, what I'd suggest is that, Mark, we hear from you and any last question, and then we'll see if there are questions from the line. I want to make sure that we get them in. I think we're just at that point now.
Okay, absolutely. I was looking at the time. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just
Mark, on this particular, yeah.
Yeah, on this red line issue. I mean, the trajectory of North Korea's progress with its missile program indicates that probably by the time of the end of the first term of the next U.S. president, North Korea would be able to hit the U.S. mainland. So that is a very important sort of deadline of sorts, and why this issue needs to be at the top of the agenda. But meanwhile, I wouldn't have ever want to suggest, and I'm sure nobody would, that that's the only red line. I mean, South Korea and Japan already fall within North Korea's missile ranges. And the extent to which North Korea can continue to improve its nuclear weapons and mount them on their no-dump missiles and hit Japan and South Korea is a very serious concern. So there should, I would put nuclear testing, any further nuclear tests, as another part of the red line.
Okay, I can think of some follow-up to that, but as Rachel said, there are people out there who will want to weigh in here and have their own questions. So should we open out now and see what questions are out there?
Julian, thanks so much. David, let me turn it over to you to reach out to those on the line.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the floor is open for your questions. If you would like to ask an audio question, you may do so now by pressing star 1. And our first question comes from Howard Kilby.
Good morning. It's an honor to be able to attend this conference. I'm very interested in diplomatic relations being established between the United States of America and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It seems to me that that is a logical step forward, and I would like to know why we cannot engage in establishing a peace treaty. Thank you very much.
So that may be Suzanne?
Well, the issue with the peace treaty, the North Koreans have made, this is one of the things they've made clear, is that that is their first priority at this stage. I think the part of, from the U.S. perspective, the fear is, or the concern, I should say, is that if we go down that road and conclude it, then there would be no incentive for the North Koreans to discuss any aspects of their nuclear program. I mean, one thing we've tried in our unofficial dialogue is the notion of simultaneous tracks, and I think the Chinese have proposed this too. One track of discussion on the peace treaty, a second track on nuclear issues, and the North Koreans have rejected that at this time, at least in an official context. But I think that's something that can be pursued in track two. But I agree with you absolutely that we should try to get this dialogue off the ground. I would caution against putting the restoration of diplomatic relations between the two countries as part of this, an early goal or objective. I think when you do that, it complicates things. If we had done that with the Iranians, for example, I don't think we ever would have gotten to a deal at this stage. So I think, having some very specific key goals that are achievable and work through those incrementally is a far better way to approach it.
Mark, do you want to weigh in, or should we go to the next question?
Well, I'd just say I agree with Suzanne on that. Establishing relations is something that was one of the goals of the joint statement of in September 2005 of the six-party talks. There was supposed to be there was one group was working on relations between the United States and North Korea, another one on Japan, North Korea, and that was all tied to the goal of denuclearization. So any movement toward relations should be tied to that. But I think it's important to realize that diplomatic relations is not something that's on top of North Korea's agenda. What's important is to have some way of communication. It's not going to start with relations, and so let's focus on how to have dialogue. Relations are rather far down the road.
Okay, shall we go for the next question?
Our next question comes from Julian Larafi.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Can I just ask that you identify yourself as well so we know where you're calling in from?
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask two main questions. My first question, can we say that we can liken, compare the situation in North Korea with France in the 15 and 16? Because the North Korean leaders, came to the conclusion that there is no global power who can protect them. And we know that, in the nuclear strategy, that alliances can't work, in the nuclear era. And we can say from this, that North Korea is now a reality, is a nuclear power. And as the North Korean leaders say, we discuss on the point that North Korea is a nuclear power. And on this, I think there is a turn point in this side. I would like, of course, with your answer and this discussion, know more. My second question: can we say
hang on, should we just keep it at one question? But could you just say where you're calling from?
From Morocco.
Thank you.
I'm calling from Morocco.
What? Okay, well, we'll stick with one question because people understand. I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but maybe I
think I got it.
Persons could.
You go.
Second question.
No, well, let's just keep it
We're just going to thank you. Yeah, we're going to take one question and then we'll go back to the queue. Thank you. So, Mark and Suzanne, I think also the key is, and you began to address that as well, the reality of having a nuclear power versus, as Suzanne, some of the things you were talking about, an aspirational power.
So this is the key question. Can North Korea be regarded as a nuclear power? Can the United States negotiate with them on that basis? And the answer is no, for diplomatic reasons. None of the parties concerned here is willing to accept that North Korea is legitimately nuclear armed. South Korea and Japan, America's key allies in the region, absolutely will not accept this. So neither can the United States. This is a kind of a diplomatic legality, however. The other question is, as a matter of reality, they have nuclear devices, and that's the reality. And so, how to deal with this country that is improving its nuclear devices is the key objective of what have to be some serious talks.
Okay, sure. Suzanne, do you want to weigh in, or the next question?
No, I just absolutely agree with that, and I think this is a tough situation for the U.S. government to be in. The reality is, let's be blunt about it, North Korea is a nuclear power. But in terms of how we recognize them officially, for all the reasons Mark said, it's problematic, and of course, most importantly, because our allies feel similarly too and are threatened. But I think we can go into discussions and negotiations with the North Koreans and be vague about this to get to more specific talks. I mean, one of the things, and maybe Track 2 can play a role here, but one of the things I think we could do through Track 2 is discuss with them in detail the problems of having nuclear weapons, the issues that they raise, how it makes them nuclear targets, how it's subject to misinterpretation, accidents, miscalculation from others who either have the capability in the region or will then want to have it. So there's a whole agenda for dialogue, I think, that is important to have.
Our next question comes from Peter Knudsen. Peter Knudsen, your line is open. You may ask your question now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm here with my 8th grade science students, and I had them submit a question to me. So this is from 2 students of mine, Ben and Alana. So if the United States finds out there's a direct threat with a nuclear missile, will the U.S. reconsider a first strike option?
It's a very sophisticated question from an 8th grader. I was a 7th grader myself. I think I'm going to, I really don't know what the answer to that question is. So at this point, I would say I'm not sure what the answer is. But again, these are the questions that I think the next president will be grappling with. And I'll just turn it over to Mark to see if he has any smarter thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me say that if the United States gets from its intelligence and its overhead satellites an indication that North Korea is preparing a nuclear-armed missile to launch at the United States or at Japan, I am pretty sure that the United States would employ forces to try to knock it out while it's still on the launch pad. This would be a preemptive attack, but not with a nuclear weapon. The United States does not need to use nuclear weapons to knock out a North Korean missile. It has lots of smart weapons that can do so with precision and lethality. But whether the United States would, in the absence of such a clear intelligence signal, launch a preemptive attack, I think the answer to that is no, because of concern with how does North Korea respond to that. They're not going to just sit back and take it. They're going to attack Seoul, attack U.S. bases in South Korea, and then the Korean War resumes. So the key is, if North Korea is preparing something, do you get intelligence? Is it good intelligence? And can you make a decision in time? These are very difficult questions for the administration. It's what you need a very smart person in the White House.
Yeah, and in connection with that, have you heard from either of the candidates for their campaign any hints of what they may be thinking about the North Korean problem?
Well, I think from Mr. Trump, we've heard all sorts of things. Some are highly disturbing. Everything from he'd want to be have a bromance with Kim Jong-un to taking them out and apparently feeling okay if both South Korea and Japan went for nuclear weapons capacity themselves. Which is totally against U.S. interests. On the other hand, it was interesting. Hillary Clinton recently said when she gathered a group of national security experts, she did make a public statement at that time, it was after the nuclear test, that she would try to pursue talks similar to what we did with Iran with North Korea. I took that as a very good signal. I think the Clinton team recognizes that by virtue of North Koreans' recent progress, whether they like it or not, and I'm sure they don't, this is going to be one of the top priority areas, if she does win, that she's going to have to deal with.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, thank you. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 now.
Great. I think, David, unless there's other questions, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and in particular, I want to reach out to the teacher that just called with the 8th graders, and I think we're all just delighted both for your interest in the sophistication of the question. So thank you for that, and it's really rewarding to know that these issues remain as center for all of us. Julian, I'm gonna thank everybody and then give you any final word on this. But on behalf of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I really do want to thank Julian Borger for taking time to focus on these issues with us, and Suzanne DiMaggio and Mark Fitzpatrick, who spend an awful lot of time thinking through on issues of North Korea tend to get put on the side because they're so difficult as to kind of reach almost intractable that many would rather not focus on it because the answers are so few, and yet what we've heard today is the consequences are so great, and it's certainly not moving in a direction that any of us feel any comfort in. So I want to thank on behalf of the Bulletin and Julian, I want to extend our gratitude and appreciation, and I'll just turn it over to you to conclude the call.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to voice appreciation very much of the Bulletin that keeps these issues certainly in my inbox, but also tries to keep them in the public discourse despite this aversion to dealing with this seemingly impossible, at least intractable problem. So I'd very much like to thank Mark and Suzanne, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope others did too.
Hey, thank you, everybody. We look forward to you joining the next call. Bye-bye.
Thanks
Rachel. This is fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's presentation. You may disconnect your phone lines, and thank you for joining us this morning.